Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Tatiana Kolavu. This is Stronger, the name of my monthly newsletter on LinkedIn, but most importantly, the live show where I tag along content that I have shared in the newsletter. And this month, I'm very excited to talk with all of you about cultural competence and cultural humility. I'm coming to you from sunny today, Bloomington, Indiana, where I live. And as you are joining us, I'd love for you to tell us where you're from and tell us a little bit about your weather as well as we get into the fall season. This month in Stronger, I talked about cultural humility and cultural competence. Can we all level up? And that's the question I asked, and I tagged it onto a story that happened or was the life of a good friend of mine who told me about an incident where she made a mistake, a gaffe, you would say, rushing into work and scraping someone's parked car. She was frazzled. She had heard bad news about her mom, who was in the hospital. She had just dropped off her kids. And the assumptions that were made about what happened got a little bit out of control. And the story ended with a very angry human resources manager in her office accusing her. And I use that as an example of the quick assumptions and sometimes biases we may have as we interact on a regular basis. And I wanted to bring an expert in our show to discuss your questions, other stories, and mainly and most importantly, tools that we all have. I'm looking at already people jumping in. Michelle has been from Indiana, living in Germany. We've got friends from Kenya and Cape Town, from Washington, D.C., and Uruguay, where spring is coming. I love that. We've got from Italy, dreaming of Greece. Uh, a lot of you are attending, and I have to tell you every time, I never take this for granted. And thank you so much for taking the time either to watch this later in a recording or do it live. Berkeley, California, the weather is always sunny there. I think the weather people I have boring jobs because they report 70 something and sunny. New York City, my daughter is moving there so soon. Kent, England, I'm sorry you have, Kevin, rainy weather in England, and we will send you some of our sunshine. My guest today is Mary Frances Winters, and I'm so very grateful that she's taking time to be with us today. I will tell you that she has ran a company for over 40 years. She's the CEO of the Winters Group, close to 40 years that the company has provided tools and skill sets to organizations to level up their inclusion and their diversity initiatives. And I would say she is the authority on the topic, and that's why I've invited her to join us. She also has written several courses and has developed them for the LinkedIn Learning platform. One we will discuss today is the cultural or cultivating cultural competence and inclusion. Mary Frances, let me look at my notes here. I want to make sure I get it right. She has been awarded the Profiles in Diversity Journal Award, the Winds of Change Award. She's been featured in Forbes as one of the most DC's most powerful women. She has been awarded through the Chamber of Commerce on contributing and elevating women in the community. And she even got to carry an Olympic torch and was awarded the Athena Award. It is my great pleasure to have Mary Frances Winters join us. Let's have her join our group and say a big cheer and a thank you for you being with us today, Mary Frances. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Everyone joining in from around the globe, literally.
I see.
How is your weather, Mary Frances? You're in North Carolina, you told me.
I am in Charlotte, North Carolina today, and the weather is nice. It's 77 degrees and sunny, so it's really nice. I see we have people from Turks and Caicos Islands, and I love Turks and Caicos. And we have people from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Been to Sao Paulo, love Brazil. My goodness. All over the world. This is amazing.
It's pretty international, I'm telling you. Turks and Caicos, we wish we had your weather as well, too. So our learners are very, very inquisitive. They drop questions. They are working. They probably are taking a lunch break or a morning coffee break or an evening if they're on the other side of the world, and they're watching us wanting to hear more, to learn more, to know how to be very much more inclusive in their mindset and in how they interact with others. What would you say are some of your first tips that you give people when they say, how do we level up that cultural competence and inclusion? Mary Frances.
My first tip is really self-awareness. And I know that we say this a lot. We say this in leadership courses. And I think that that truly is the first step. I have a colleague from South Africa, actually, who will say, there is no such thing as a view from nowhere. And so we get our view from somewhere. We get our worldview. We get the way we think, our opinions, and we sometimes just take them for granted. We sometimes don't think about why we think the way we think or why we have a particular perspective. So that's the first step, is really self-awareness. What are your cultural norms, and how did you learn them? For those of people, we have people from all around the world, and we know that when you go into another country, there are unwritten rules that you may not know about, but you soon learn if you violate those rules. And so I think it's really important for that. And the other thing I think is around the self-awareness is what I call metacognition or meta thinking about why we think. Why am I thinking that? And so I think that would be, the very, very first step. And it's not about criticizing your culture necessarily, but it's being aware that your behaviors, by and large, are culturally informed.
So when you say self-awareness, we obviously have to pause and question, why am I thinking this way? Why does this seem so strange and different to me? And in your course, you talk about the 4E model of cultural competence. Exposure is the very first step. Mm-hmm. I agree with you 100%. Having come from a different part of the world and being and working in the United States, there's so many things that I literally thought was so alien to me, but I had to stop and think, why am I feeling this way? If we don't expose ourselves, what happens?
Well, if we don't expose ourselves to difference, we stay in our own bubble of people who think like us. And when we do come then into situations where there are differences, we don't know how to handle them. And it can lead to conflict. So exposure is one of the 4 E's that I talk about. And exposure just means that there's difference around you, that you are in environments, but that doesn't necessarily, the second E is experience, because just because you have exposure doesn't mean that you're having meaningful experiences. Doesn't mean that you're having conversations, with people, meaningful conversations to understand, who they are, how they have come, their story, right? What is their story? What's their origin story? And so that's the next step. Experience. And then education is really important. Today is education, right? But there are many other ways to get education, through documentaries, visiting museums. And that's a lifelong, from my perspective, it's lifelong. When people say to me, well, I'll be happy when we don't have to talk about this diversity stuff anymore. Well, I don't think that's ever going to be, because there's always something to learn. I use a piano analogy, and I say, if you learn how to play the piano and you become competent in it, you don't stop practicing and you don't stop learning new pieces. So if this is a skill, and I believe it is a skill, then it's ongoing. But we have to be committed to it. And so in one of my books, Inclusive Conversations, I talk about the first condition to have an inclusive conversation is have the commitment. And I think from your perspective too, Tatiana, what you talk about is humility. I think humility is wrapped up in that commitment. It's a commitment to recognize yourself, know yourself, and recognize that you don't know everything. That's the humility part, right? That you don't know everything, and that you're curious and willing to step back and willing to question your own, perhaps very, beliefs that you've had that you've had for years, and you're rigid around them, and be willing, as you say, to question them and say, to pause. And I think the pause is so important. The 4th E in my 4E model is empathy. And you cannot have empathy without the other 3 E's, because if I've not had much exposure or experience, it's going to be very hard for me to empathize with you, because empathy means you're able to take the other person's perspective or walk in the other person's shoes, right? You can't do that if you don't have any experience around it. So empathy is really important. Empathy, to me, again, is connected to your concept around humility. But it's not something that you can just say, okay, I'm going to be empathetic. You still have to have that experience and exposure and education to be able to do so.
Absolutely. I wanted to go back to your content, what you talked a little bit about. If we don't expose ourselves or educate ourselves, we stay on our own bubble. When I wrote the course on cultural humility, I stayed on the approach of in groups and out groups, where you don't really have to cross borders of a country. You could be in your in group with the people from your company, the people from your family, the people in your neighborhood. It's when we do this, we like to be with people that are like us, and we then create this bubble, as you say, where we look on the outside and we think they're all wrong and we're right, and it's very hard for others to enter. So I find this in organizations now, and especially in the last few years where we spend so much time working remotely, we created our own other microcosms, and it was difficult to come back and have our own joint culture in our workplace. I wonder if that bubble is, someone has to be self-aware. Sometimes a leader in this group has to be self-aware to say, wait a minute, we're excluding so many others because of the way that we are connecting. Do you find this, do you ever have to shake someone in the shoulder and go in a consulting project and say, you have a bubble going on here that you need to disperse?
Yes, I think I first go in with having the people think about the commitment that you want to do this. Because if you don't want to, if people are, some people are very happy in their bubble, okay? And they're not really interested in becoming more cross-culturally, competent. So that's establishing that first. What's your why? What's your reason for wanting to do this? And your reason might be because you work in an organization where you have people from different countries and people from different backgrounds. And in order to do our work well, we have to understand each other in order to get greater innovation by leveraging all of those differences. And so I think that there has to be a motivation. And those people who are not motivated to do so, I think they will miss out. And if an organization has certain values and certain policies and practices that says we are an inclusive organization, we promote inclusion, then that's the, you want to work here, then you need to come out of that, out of the bubble.
Yeah.
But they need to be able to have the skills, which is some of the things that we do, right, in order to do that. Because I'm not saying we're bad people. I think what happens sometimes in this work, we look at binaries, right? It's either this or this, and the world is not. It's not the world is not, doesn't operate in binaries, right? There's so much in between, and so I think that we have to meet people where they are and recognize that diversity just is. I mean, we like to say, oh, we're just all people and we're all just alike. Well, we're alike because we're all human. However, cultures create, vast differences, and in order to be a productive organization, in order to be a productive society, it behooves us to understand what those differences are. And it can be something as simple as a behavior like eye contact, or something where we judge, in the Western world, if someone doesn't make eye contact, right? And in another culture, it could be a sign of respect and reverence.
Yeah.
And reverence. But if we don't know those things, then we make judgments based on that. I have many examples from, clients where people were rated lower on their performance because of a behavior that was a cultural behavior that the individual didn't even know they were doing, because many things just become second nature when you're taught that. Right? And another culture looked at that as something negative. Again, the binary. This is wrong.
And if that person in an organization is in human resources, I think they have an even bigger responsibility to be a lot more attuned and aware. Our learner, Anna, is saying, thanks for saying that you need experience dealing with culturally different people to gain cultural competence and empathize. You cannot empathize if you have no clue to walk in that other person's shoes. And that's where the exposure comes specifically to. Thank you, Anna, for sharing. I wanted to touch upon some of what you said. It's a competitive advantage for organizations. Yes. My daughter is recruiting to join companies, and I can tell you, as a a 22-year-old looking very closely at what the makeup of the company is, how they speak on a day-to-day level, the language that they use, or what others say about them online, that can attract the right people, or if you want to be competitive, the highly skilled people. It matters so much.
Mhm.
I wonder, for our learners, do they see how that is creating a competitive advantage? And I also would wonder, you are quite often invited into companies to help them level up their their diversity initiatives, or make sure that they are more inclusive. What happens when there's no buy-in by some managers, directors, or employees?
Well, that's why this work is so complex and so difficult, actually, because you may have buy-in at the very top level, but
Mm,
then you may not have buy-in at the, at the middle level.
mm,
And again, I think some of it can be by edict. It's like, this is what we're going to do.
yeah.
These are our values in the organization. But I think the other part of it has to be by motivation, right? What's in it for me? Why do I want to
Yeah.
do this? And at the middle manager level, I think, setting norms at the team level. How are we going to treat each other?
Mm,
What are we going to do if someone says something that for another person would seem inappropriate, right? Are we going to do an ouch and educate? But what are we going to do? And I think at the team level, allow the team to develop what those norms are going to be.
yeah.
We're going to first recognize our diversity as a strength. We're going to learn more about each other, our communication styles, our conflict styles. And, there are many tools that can help us to do that. And then we're going to honor that I might be a direct communicator, which I am, a very direct communicator, but I might be interfacing with someone who is an indirect communicator. And that happened to me, where I sent an email some years ago to a client, and I just was, talking like I would talk, and I got feedback back that I was being rude and disrespectful, and I thought, my goodness, rude and disrespectful.
Wow.
But my client was a more indirect communicating culture, and as such, they found my directness to be off-putting, and so I have to pause, and I think about that now, particularly with social media today, and with the way that we communicate. Oftentimes, we're not communicating like we are now, talking with one another. We're communicating in writing, or we're communicating, in cryptic kinds of ways. We're sending a text, and so I always pause and I reread, what I've written, to say, how is this going to be, received on the other end.
Yeah. Wonderful self-awareness. And what a gift that the client actually told you that you were too direct, because otherwise you would not have known. Quite often, if we pause and say, you may have meant for this to come across this way, but this is how it did, and here's the impact that it had.
Right.
So useful.
Intent versus impact, right? That's one of the skills
Yeah.
that we teach in cross-cultural communication, is that,
Mhm.
I always assume positive intent, that people have positive intent, but I want to own my impact, because the impact may, may be different. And this, opens up the opportunity, for dialogue. One of my books, We Can't Talk About That at Work: How to Talk About Race, Religion, Politics, and Other Polarizing Topics.
I love the title, by the way.
We can't, speaks to the idea that, these are topics that we are talking about at work, given the world political climate, that we're in. And we need to have the skills to be able to do so. And one of those skills is pause. One of those skills is self-awareness. One of those skills, and it's not that we're not ever going to make a mistake. We'll make mistakes, but how you handle that mistake. If you're able to say, if the person who is offended is able to use I language and say, when I heard you say that, it made me feel this way because this means this in my cultural context. And then the other person would say, gee, I didn't know that. I apologize. This is a great learning for me. And so that opens up the opportunity, rather than, oh, you're being too sensitive, or, well, this is the way we do it here, right? That's that binary again. And so I think, and it's a skill to be able to have those kinds of conversations.
And hopefully that person from that culture is direct enough to address it, because this is where I find so much conflict around all this is we don't have the practice and the skills to even start by communicating and expressive. And then we end up with this passive aggressiveness and all of this the layering that comes in, and probably you come in to do training and you end up doing conflict resolution. I'm looking at our learner here from the Netherlands says, my son, a TCK, I'm not sure I know what that means, is now facing cultural differences working in Rotterdam.
TCK is a third culture kid.
Third culture kid. Thank you. Working Chinese company. Having lived in many countries, he has the advantage anyway. It's not easy. Dutch and Chinese are so different. That is so true. And at times you take the third culture kid and think maybe he has Chinese. There's even a movie about this, I think. He has origin. So they put him in front of the Chinese company, and there's even more cultural conflict regarding that. I'm not sure if that's happening there, but this is very real. Mary Frances, earlier you talked about eye contact being the one example where we can quickly make an assumption around it. And I love the literal example that comes up in your course, where when you talk about acceptance, you have two professionals. I'm hoping we can run it and show it. And the candidate doesn't make very good eye contact. And the professional is so curious versus being judgmental. If we can all leave here with curiosity, the big C word we want to take home, let's watch kind of how he processes the lack of eye contact. Thank you, Shelby, by the candidate.
What's on Amy?
Overall, I was impressed with her background. The one thing I guess that stood out to me was her eye contact throughout. At first, I started to judge it as her being nervous or lacking confidence. But then I considered whether or not it may be a cultural difference. I took a cross-cultural communications lab a few months back, where I learned that some cultures see making eye contact as being disrespectful, and more indirect forms of communication are the norm. I wonder if that may have been a factor here.
So smooth and so humble, I may say, speaking of cultural humility, not jumping to conclusions.
Right. And yeah, I think looking at alternate interpretations. So my definition of culture is the behavioral interpretation of how a group lives out its values in order to survive and thrive. So being that it's the behavioral interpretation, right? What is the interpretation of that behavior, and looking at what else might it be? And so in our culture, particular behavior might be seen, thinking of space and proximity when people are, too close to you, right? Sometimes that's cultural. And whether you kiss, shake, or bow, and I mean those are simple kinds of things, and oftentimes they're more subtle. I was working with an organization a number of years ago, and they were partnering with a company from India, and they were setting up a call center. And each month they would meet, or every week they would meet. I don't remember now. And when they finished, the U.S. Company thought that there was a clear path in terms of what was going to be done before the next meeting. And when the next meeting came, those things had not been done. And they kept meeting, and those things were not done. So the U.S. company was very frustrated. But the individuals from India didn't want to say in front of their managers or bosses that they didn't understand, because they didn't want their boss to look, saving face. They didn't want their boss to look. And they would say yes, but it didn't necessarily mean they were going to complete that. It meant, yes, I understand.
Yes.
And so they spent a whole year going through, and nothing got done. So you speak about productivity, you speak about, the reason that this is very important. If you're working cross-culturally, it can lead to not only misunderstandings and conflict, but it can lead to missed deadlines, and that can cost organizations a lot of money.
And the assumptions, even you don't need to cross borders or put two companies from two different countries together. A different work style, a different communication style, as you said, a new person coming into a group, and we quickly make an assumption about them because of one thing we relate to a past experience that we've had. I love how you identify the culture as a way that a group lives out its values, and exposure, or I would say observance. Just sit on a bench and just watch how people talk to one another, walk beside one another, interact, and look or don't, or as you said, shake hands or bow, to pick up on that. That's why it's important as we travel to build in some buffer time to observe and do that exposure. Lisa asks us a great question, and I've seen this come up a little bit. Do you see more buy-in and opportunities for diversity inclusion in established countries? And I'd love to know, Lisa, your description of that, but compared to developing countries, as job security outweighs company cultures. So maybe in the work that you do, Mary Frances, do you have, I'm guessing if Lisa is asking, does it matter more to developed economies that we can be as competitive as possible, and maybe countries or companies that are starting and developing, it can't be a priority? I'm guessing.
Well, thank you for helping to clarify, because I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I believe it's even more important in developing corporate cultures, organizational cultures, because they have an opportunity to build that culture. If it's new, they have an opportunity to change it and to build it. What I've found is in entrenched cultures that are, very old and have been around for a long time, it's much harder to change those cultures. We're working now with a new medical school, and it's only been around for 3 years. And so there's an opportunity to shape the values, to shape the culture, around inclusion, which is what they're absolutely doing. So I think it's easier when you're newer, to build in to the organization and the culture, than those when I work with companies that are like 150 years old. Really, really hard to change.
I think her question was about developed countries versus developing countries. And I wanted to jump on that. I had heard, or I knew of conflict that existed between two developed countries. I think it was Netherlands and the US, where in the meetings, the Dutch were calling the group girls. They were saying guys and girls, and they were calling the women girls. And it was driving the females crazy. And they brought that up as an example in a live group. I was in the fishbowl, and they said, so for example, when you do this, you're making too much of a fuss. I must say that seeing the other perspective, our inclusion and the focus that we pay on language seems, I would say, an exaggeration to some countries. It's too hard for them to understand because it's not an issue. It's a non-issue. And for us, we're trying, and especially for multinational companies, are trying to make that part of the agenda. It's important. Or let's flip it. It's harmful to some people to hear that. They don't want to hear. Let's just go beside what you think. Do you find that to be a kind of an agenda or a level of importance where it hits, and you're bringing probably a lot of groups together, establishing those norms? That must be challenging.
It is. And I think creating psychological safety where people feel that they can speak up, in the moment, when things are happening. I think those are the kinds of skills that I try to outline and give examples about and how to do it, relative to being in the moment, and how do you have that conversation. And I think it depends, power dynamics, right? If it's your boss who is making, calling you girl, it might be a little bit more difficult. So in my book, Inclusive Conversations, Fostering Equity empathy and belonging across difference. I give an example of a woman who is going to her boss to talk about the fact that she feels that she hasn't been given all of the opportunities. And I recommend to create an equitable a situation where you have an equitable conversation, that the boss should, acknowledge up front, put it in the room. I know that I have power because I am your boss. However, in this conversation, I would really like this to be an equitable conversation where your voice is just as important as my voice. Now, that may not happen, but acknowledging the power differential, at least you're putting it out there to acknowledge that. I think that the woman who is coming to the boss appreciates, the acknowledgement of that, and perhaps would feel freer, to speak her mind.
Yeah. In the research that I did, the term cultural humility, coined by Tervalon and Murray Garcia, does their first part of research with physicians and what patients thought of their interactions. And the physicians, because of the power differential, that didn't make assumptions, that asked continuous open-ended questions to try to understand, were the ones that received the much higher marks in how they treated the patients. But back to that, if you all are listening to this and have that power differential, not just acting on it, as Mary Frances said, but being aware of it, right. On how you may not be looked at directly. Maybe this is because of your authority, or maybe it's because of your age or in this culture, or maybe it's because of what you're wearing, the white coat syndrome that we talk about. And being aware in the workplace, when a manager openly says, does anyone have any comments? Who is going to speak up in a culture where that is not perceived as an okay thing to do? Exactly. What other times have you seen conflict in the work that you do? We talk about this being sort of discussing cultural competence and humility in the trenches. Where do you see the sticky points happen in between two people, or in managers and leaders and their groups, or the organizations as a whole, or all of them?
Yeah, I think you see it every day, at the worker to worker level, where individuals just don't understand each other because there may be a cultural difference. You see judgments being made. Let's say someone is more has a more reserved behavior style, and that could be interpreted as they don't have anything to say because they don't know, because they're not knowledgeable. Whereas, as you know, in some cultures, more of the collective cultures, it's not about I, it's about we. So we may sit back. But I've seen this happen, particularly in performance evaluations, where the people use very subjective means of evaluating someone's performance based on behaviors, right? Again, the behavioral interpretation, right? So Sam never speaks up in meetings, right? And so that could be something. And I've seen this when I'm working with leaders, and I probe with them and I say, well, why do you think that is? Well, I don't know, but he needs to speak up more in meetings. And then we talk about, are there other ways to get input from Sam, perhaps other than in that meeting? So I had one client say to me, he said, well, I know how I'm going to fix this. He said, I'm going to go around the room.
Oh, everyone.
And I'm going to go around the room and everybody has to give their opinion. And I said, okay. I thought, great. Well, maybe you kind of misunderstood what I was saying about cultural differences. And so we had that conversation about how that could be very intimidating for some people. And it's not just your culture. It could be your learning style. That's a diversity dimension as well. Yeah. And so some people, introverts tend to need to process more before they can just, blurt out. I'm one that can just blurt out, I just say what I want, but others may not be able to do that. So we try to teach leaders to take into account different ways that people engage and are going to be able to do their best work. And can you have a variety of ways of getting input, and not just your way. Again, the self-awareness. This is the way I prefer. I have somebody who works for me, and he prefers written communication. I prefer, verbal, communication, because I feel I misunderstand many of the things, in writing. So we're working on that. We're working on, I am his boss, but rather than dictate to him how he should communicate, are there ways that we can come to some kind of a mutual adaptation around how we communicate?
You can send more recordings instead of writing emails. So at least it's a in between. I'd like to flip that and also say, for a lot of our learners, maybe they're not the manager that has to have the self-awareness, but it's okay for someone to say to you, you're not speaking up, or you're not telling us what you think. So therefore, we don't know if you're invested or not. I'm working with a person right now who needs to be sure, very analytical, very technical, doesn't want to speak up because doesn't want to say anything that's not accurate. To him, that's a huge credibility bust to do that. And however, he recognizes that he's there, which is great self-awareness, and may have to preface to say, if I had to answer now, I may not be giving you the correct number, but I would guess this. So he knows that it's important for him to step in the conversation, but we've had the awareness of saying, listen, you're pushing me, and if you want to know right now, it may not be accurate, because to him, accuracy is really, really important. So some of it the manager owns, but I would like to say, if someone is saying this to you, you may have to flex your style as well. I'm wondering if our learners have any other questions or situations. These situations are difficult to write just in a question, though there may be more background behind this. One idea or one example that I had, being on a call where a person is sort of dismissive, or this person tends to do this a lot in a kind of a passive aggressive way. When there's a problem, doesn't address it, but changes their behavior. Isn't that hard to breathe through, Mary Frances? How can you create acceptance when, okay, Mary Frances, whatever you want to do, that's fine. And obviously that I'm being a little passive aggressive. Do you address that?
I'm not sure. That can be a little bit difficult. I think the way that I have found to be best is to, ask probing questions. Can you tell me, more about that? I'm not sure I quite understood, your intent. So I kind of put it back on the individual, but I give that benefit of the doubt, if you will, or allowing the individual to say more. That's how I would handle that.
Or to say, the other day you were a little quiet. Is everything okay? Or is there something else that is happening? I find that also useful in them knowing that you recognize the behavior, if there is intention behind the behavior, or maybe the impact that you can describe specifically.
But I first really probe with myself to say, why did that bother me? Is there a need for me to have that conversation? Is it okay for that person to be quiet? And so I would want to go there first, because I think sometimes if we go directly to the individual and say, well, I noticed that you were quiet, there maybe have been something personal that they really don't want to go into. So I would be, it depends on the relationship, right? It depends on the relationship that you have with the individual. If it's a power relationship where you're in the power position, it may not be best to do that. If it's more of a friend relationship, then I think that can, where there's trust. I talk about in my book, Inclusive Conversations, I talk about trust and the need to have a trust in order to have an effective, inclusive conversation.
Sure. Trust takes time.
And it takes time. Absolutely.
Yes. Does it matter? Do we come in with that notion? We have to put energy there to say, if we want to build the relationship, that's trust. That takes time. The example you gave with the work not being done in the two different, the Indian and the US culture, sometimes we tend to just assume we're all working for the same company, so let's get this piece going. And the other, maybe the same company, they're in a different part of the country. If you don't go there and break bread and show that you are interested in building the relationship,
right.
But those things take time. And if we fast forward through that, I think it hinders the quality of work that can be done, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, because some cultures are much more relationship oriented and some are much more task oriented, right? And so that's another thing. And even within a country that can, that can vary.
Sure.
And even within a functional area, an engineer versus a human resources person who might be more, human resources might be more relationship oriented. The engineer might be more task oriented, right?
Sure.
I'm not trying to stereotype. I'm just saying we have to consider, the reason for some of the differences.
Never a dull moment. And I would say job security for the Winters Group, that's for sure. I am so intrigued on the edition of the book, We Can't Talk About That at Work. That's coming up. I think we put a link up for that. And very grateful, I would say, that the Winters Group and for you are putting this out there, because it's absolutely necessary to have conversations even around that, or say, do you remember this conversation we had a hard time doing or having? How would you say, we have one more question that I want to address, but what is the feedback you've received and how did you make it better in the second edition?
So the first edition of We Can't Talk About That at Work was published in 2017. And a lot has happened in our world since 2017. So let me just give you one example. So in the book, in 2017, I talked about the advisability of virtual meetings, having virtual meetings where you might be talking about a sensitive or polarizing topic. So at that time, I wasn't recommending virtual meetings. Well, since 2017, we had a pandemic, and many meetings now, obviously we're using, the virtual world much more than we were then. So that's a big change, a big whole new section, on that. And we've refreshed some of the examples. The George Floyd murder happened, since then. The political polarization has gotten even worse, since then. And so, so we have a lot of new examples, and, making the case in terms of why it's so important for us to learn to have conversations across our differences, because we'll never make progress as a society if we don't.
For sure. Trying to understand. I teach a course now called Doing Business in Greece, and our political spectrum is so much broader than the one in the United States. And the students are sitting there shaking their head because they have nothing to relate it to. And I try to connect economy with politics and culture and maybe why in history, but it goes back to being able to educate yourself on different is not deficient. It's coming from somewhere else. Our friend here from LinkedIn said, I experienced this trust takes time while working in Angola for the Italian embassy. Two very different cultures. Trust takes time. And we said that. One more final question from Jay, who is a frequent attender of our lives. I have a question. He says, I have a problem in the workplace. I don't feel as comfortable in behaving in the same self-confidence I have normally. So he's easier with a cup of coffee during the break versus in the meeting. Any suggestions? I have some thoughts. Do you have any tips for Jay to be able to be more effective?
Yeah. So in the book, I give an example of, and I don't know if this is, We Can't Talk About That at Work or Inclusive Conversations, where this woman feels very intimidated when she has to have a performance review. She gets very, very nervous. And when the performance review was conducted in an office setting where the boss was on one side of the desk and the employee was on the other side of the desk, that was, was very intimidating. And so instead, they went for a coffee, right? And had a very much more like leisurely, kind of casual kind of a conversation. They talked about her work and whatnot. And then she said at the end, well, when are we going to do my performance review? He said, we just had it.
We just did.
We just did. Right. So I do think that, sometimes when something happens in a meeting that you didn't like or that you think needs to be corrected, you really have to have a sense of the culture, a sense of the group and the individual to know, is it good for me to mention it here, to bring it up here, or should I call this person aside and ask for some time after the meeting? You don't want to, I don't want to embarrass that person. It could take the meeting and, off into a different direction. However, if it's going to impact the balance of the meeting, you may want to stop. And one of the recommendations, this is not something that I developed, but another colleague developed, is called like an ouch and educate. So if you have these team norms, and in your norms, you recognize that when something happens that seems inappropriate, that seems disrespectful, that you're going to stop. We're going to stop because everybody knows we're going to do that. I responded to this comment this way because of this. And then someone, and I know that probably wasn't your intent, but could we just take a moment to, to have this conversation? I did this with my team recently, where somebody said this phrase, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a monkey by the toe. And that phrase is very offensive to African Americans because it used to be eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch the N-word by the toe.
I thought it was a tiger.
No, it's very different, right? It can be very different.
I can see that.
Right. And so, and so I took the opportunity to stop the meeting. And I said, I'm not calling out this individual. I said, but here's an example of a phrase that we all say, and if we don't understand how it could be, discriminatory or offensive to, to a particular group. So if there's no cut and dry answer, Jay, in terms of whether you talk about something in a meeting or you do it, afterwards, I think it depends on the trust level. It depends on the group, the camaraderie that they have, the relationship that they have. But we certainly don't want to call people out and make them feel like they're being ostracized or punished for something that their intent may have been good, but the impact may not have been. So I hope that's helpful, Jay.
And Jay, I would say for you may be less comfortable discussing certain topics in that group meeting. Maybe you need more time to think. You need to feel more relaxed. Communicate that. Say, I may need to think about this. I may be quiet because I'm not prepared, or you can say, I need to gather my thoughts about this as well as we share. So you talk about that confidence, maybe the context brings you more confidence. You're definitely, surely a more relational person. And we thank you for your comments. Eben has a question. I'm going to jump in and answer some more of the questions that we didn't get to because I want to be respectful of your time. I have asked for Shelby behind the scenes to help us with linking Mary Frances's course, the books. There is a linked, there's a podcast that is called, or has been revised, the Inclusion Solution Live podcast. And there's also a blog that you can find both on the Mary Frances Winters group. There are a group of brilliant people that are working behind the topics of inclusion and cultural competence. And I think by spending our time together here that this is an ongoing conversation and a continuous growth moment for all of us here. And Mary Frances, thank you so much for taking time to share all this with us. We look forward to the revision of your new course that's coming out next week. And a big shout out and thank you to Scott Mylard, who brought us together. He is content manager for both of our courses. And it was his idea to say, hey, why don't you do a live and discuss many of these topics with Mary Frances. So thanks for saying yes to my invitation.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I hope it's been useful for your learners.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.